In today's video I'll be painting two Space Wolves Terminators to a fairly high standard in some easy to follow steps, but in a way that you guys can easily skip a few steps if you want to have a quicker but somewhat less pretty result. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES. So if you want to see how I painted two different versions of the iconic blue-gray armor, one with Citadel paints and one with Kimera Kolors, and then the super colorful yellow shoulder pads, how I shaded everything with water mixable oil paints, super quick and easy, did all the highlighting and battle damage, plus a lot of cool light effects, then let's get painting. I started from a strong white Zenithal highlight for easier coverage and some automatic pre-shading. And if you're not familiar with Zenithal highlights, I have a full video explaining it on the channel, so I suggest checking that one out. Then I decided to go for two different color combinations, one using the standard Citadel colors for Space Wolves and one using some alternative paints to see if I can come up with something that will look like Space Wolves but without using the usual colors, and maybe to even improve on the official scheme a bit. The official color scheme starts with spraying the whole model except the right shoulder pad with the Fang, and you just got to love these names Games Workshop comes up with sometimes. I had a pot of the airbrush version on my shelf for some reason, but this works just as well with the normal non-airbrush version as well if you add a bit of thinner to it. For the alternative scheme I used black-blue from Kimera Kolors for a more bluish approach. In both cases I simply sprayed the model with multiple layers until I got full coverage, which resulted in a slightly shaded model with darker paint in the shadows and lighter paint in the highlights due to the Zenithal. Now that I had the base coat down, it was time for some highlights. For the next step I used rust grey from Citadel for the official version, spraying it into the highlight zones that are visible from the previous step and reinforcing them even further. And for the alternative version I used a 50-50 mix of black blue and silver grey from Kimera. Then for the second highlight I used Fenrisian Grey from Citadel and pure silver grey from Kimera for the official and the alternative versions respectively, and spraying them inside the middle of the previous highlights, trying to not fully cover the previous color. For the official scheme I left it at that without any further highlights, but for the alternative one I sprayed one more round of silver grey plus black blue plus white as a final highlight, because I felt that I lost a bit too much of the original blue tone and because this scheme looked a little more on the dark side. At this point I sprayed the whole model with some gloss varnish as well. The varnish will prevent the airbrush layers from reactivating and it will also help with the washing phase in a minute. But first I wanted to complete the armor with the iconic yellow shoulder pads. My goal was quite simple. I wanted to create something really saturated and warm so we have a nice contrast with the desaturated greyish armor and the winter base that I plan to use for these guys. You know, a little bit of warm color in the cold winter scenery. I started by painting the shoulder pads on both models with light rust. The airbrush tends to desaturate colors, and because I wanted to get a really saturated final result, I decided to start with the brush first. This covered about as good as you would expect, even after multiple layers, but that's okay, I just wanted to have a base to paint the next color on. The second color was my favorite orange color at the moment, simply called Orange from Kimera Kolors. But you can also use some strong and saturated orange color from any other brands as well. The color of this is beautiful, but it doesn't cover at all, so the most important thing is to get this full coverage. It's super easy to lose patience in this step and leave the surface only partially covered. Just paint as many layers as you need, and make sure that you wait for one layer to dry before you apply the next one. Simply accept that with orange, 2 layers will not be enough. Before moving on to spraying the next color with the airbrush, I use small bits of tin foil to mask the rest of the model from the overspray. And of course you can also use some masking putty if you have it. I just like the cheap and easy option with the tin foil. The important thing is to make sure you don't get the orange paint on the armor we already painted with the bluish grey. Once I was sure that the armor is more or less protected, I sprayed a 50-50 mix of orange and warm yellow from a zenithal angle. If you want to speed up the process, you can actually skip this step and move on to the next one immediately. I used it mostly because I was too impatient with my previous orange layers and wanted to complete the full coverage with this one. The real highlighting was done with a mix of deep yellow from AK Interactive and warm yellow from Kimera, first in a 50-50 mix and then adding more and more deep yellow in smaller and smaller highlights on top of the shoulder pad. If you want to simplify the scheme, you can use a nice colorful yellow from any brand without mixing it with anything. The end result will look slightly less colorful, but still pretty good, I think. At this point we painted the biggest and most important surfaces of the model in very little time. That's the huge advantage of the airbrush. The downside is that now everything is covered in the blue and grey, including the things that are supposed to be some other color. And on top of that, we can't really use traditional washes to create shading in the recesses, since that would destroy the nice color transitions we have on the armor now. The solution for the shading problem is oil washes, and because I don't like working with thinners, I got myself a set of water mixable oil paints for just this this kind of situation. But of course, if you have only traditional oils and white spirits for thinner at home, that will work exactly the same. But if you consider buying oils right now, I can absolutely recommend the Winsor & Newton water mixable ones. I took some blue and black, mixed them more or less equally, and then added quite a bit of water to it until it was just a little thicker than water. Then I just slathered this mix all over the model except the shoulder pad. And I just love this step. It's super satisfying and a little bit terrifying at the same time. If you accidentally get it on the shoulder pad, it's not a big issue though. You can simply wipe it away with some water. Once the whole model was fully covered, I took a piece of foam I had lying around, dabbed it in a little water, and started wiping away the paint from all the raised surfaces with it. There is no reason to panic about the paint drying on you. Oil paints take hours to dry, so there is plenty of time for this step. When I had the majority removed, I switched to a small makeup remover stick for more precision. I kept going until I fully removed the oil paint from all the armor panels, and it was only left in the deepest parts of the model and in the recesses. At this stage it was time to leave the models to dry overnight, since, as I said, oil paints, including the water mixable ones, take a lot longer to fully dry than acrylics. This is also the perfect opportunity to apply any basing materials on the base as well if you haven't done it yet, since it can dry together with the oils. Once everything dried, it was time to fix the second problem I mentioned earlier and fix all the overspray we did with the airbrush with some black paint. This is as simple as it gets. I painted everything that was not supposed to be bluish grey or yellow with black. The next optional step is applying the transfers, and you can of course skip this one since the colors will mark these out as Space Wolves anyway. But some transfers can really make the models pop, and Space Wolf transfers are quite easy to find. First I applied some gloss varnish with the brush on all the surfaces I wanted the transfers to be on, so in my case the shoulder pads and the shin armor. The smooth surface really helps with positioning the transfers, and later we can just add matte varnish to knock back the shine and get it in line with the rest of the model. I put a bit of water on the surface where the transfers were supposed to go. I added the transfers, positioned them carefully, and used a makeup remover to force the water and the air out from under them, smoothing the surface. When they dried, I added another level of varnish over them to fix them in place and integrate them better. Another optional step is to apply some battle damage. And once again, you can skip this, but it can really add some realism and grit to the model in my opinion. It will make them look like they're actually on the battlefield and they didn't just step out of the arming chamber. And this can look scary, but it's actually super easy to do. I simply took some whole red, but you can also use Rhinox hide or Doombull brown from Citadel, and I tore up a piece of foam and dabbed it into this paint. Then I removed most of the paint on a paper towel. If you leave too much, it can look like just a big blob of paint, so it's safer to remove more than necessary first. Then I started lightly touching the sponge to the armor, mostly concentrating on the edges and the places where the environment or some battle damage could have caused the paint to scrape off. My advice is to not go crazy with this. Less can be more, but of course it's up to you to decide what looks good on your models. Once I was happy with the amount of damage I had, it was time for the next critical step, the highlighting of the armor. This part can be quite easy if you are experienced with edge highlighting, but if you are not, then I suggest watching the edge highlighting video I have on the channel. That should make your life easier and the end result look better as well. For the first highlight I use silver grey from Kimera for both models because I like the consistency of this one, but you can also use rust grey from Citadel instead. I use this to paint all the edges of the armor and also to make a small outline around the larger battle damage marks I created to add some depth to them. For the next and final highlight I took pale blue from AK, once again because of how nicely it flows for edge highlighting, but once again you can also use the Citadel equivalent like Fenrisian grey for example. I use this to paint only the more visible edges and mostly the ones facing up towards the light, and I also add a little bit of outline inside the previous one for the biggest pieces of battle damage. For the yellow I used a single color, deep yellow from AK Interactive, but you could also go for, let's say, Flashgitz yellow from Citadel as a replacement. I use this to paint the edges of the shoulder pad and the gun casing and to mark the outline of the battle damage as well. With the highlighting done, let's move on to the details and the effects all around the model, and let's start with the eyes. There is something terrifying and really cool about these huge armored behemoths trudging through the snow with glowing red eyes, and to achieve this effect the eyes have to be quite striking and colorful compared to their surroundings. To get this kind of contrast we need to start from a fully black eye socket and then paint the raised lenses of the eye with white. The white needs to be covering the lens fully, so it's worth applying multiple layers. You can correct any mistakes with some black. For the first color I used scarlet red ink, and inks are super pigmented, and over white they produce some really strong vibrant colors, which is exactly what we need now. Once I had the lens fully covered, I took some white and painted half of the lens again. I switched to some really vibrant orange ink and painted it over the white part, creating an orange glow inside the red eye. Finally I took a tiny bit of white and dotted it inside the orange glow to enhance it even further. and this got me that nice, terrifying Terminator look I wanted to go for. For the metal bits, I use non-metallic metal because I just like it more and it's more fun to paint than true metallics. But if you want to make things easier, I suggest simply to use some traditional paints like Leadbelcher for the steel and Retributor Armor for the gold. Combining those with some washes and a couple of edge highlights should produce some good results. I will walk you guys through what I did with the non-metallic metals, but if you are using true metallics, feel free to skip ahead to the effects. For the golden eagle and the symbol on their knees, I started by painting everything with burnt red, with maybe a bit of original black remaining in the deepest shadows. Then I started highlighting with gold 79 from Kimera and covered everything fully on the right of the elements, but only edge highlighted the left. I wanted to make it look like the light is coming from the top and slightly from the right for a more dramatic effect. I switched to Sahara Yellow and edge highlighted everything on the right, but only added some partial edge highlights on the left. Ice Yellow was next, with only some partial edge highlights on the right and only a couple of dots and small lines on the left. Finally, I used a tiny bit of white for some select edges on the right and only a couple of dots on the left. For the steel elements, I also started from whole red because I wanted to make them look a bit worn and used. The first highlight was done with German Field Grey, covering around 70–80% of the surface and highlighting all the edges. Then with medium sea grey I highlighted inside the previous highlights, leaving some of the previous color behind, and marked all the edges facing up. I went up in brightness further with some silver grey on an even smaller surface and some select edges. And finally I used a little bit of white in the most visible highlights and a couple of dots here and there. At this point the majority of the models was done, but I still had a couple of very important elements to paint that would define how everything will look in the end, so let's go through those. I cleaned up some of the armor with some matte varnish where it was still glossy from when I was applying the transfers. I left the shoulder glossy though for some contrast and because the glossy varnish made it look even more colorful and vibrant. Then I mixed some flow improver and white paints to create the basis for the glow effect in the reactor. The flow improver makes the paint flow automatically into the recesses by just touching them with the brush, and this makes the process super easy. The trick is to be patient and wait for it to dry, otherwise it will mix with the fluorescent paint later and it will turn into a mess. While it was drying, I took some AK snow paste and spread it around the base for the snow effect. This step barely takes any time at all, but adds a lot to the atmosphere of the models. Once the white paint dried, I loaded some red fluorescent ink into the airbrush and sprayed it over the whole reactor. It created a nice OSL effect on the edges and a really saturated red glow over the white. Finally, I went a step further and marked some of the vents with some white paint and then sprayed some fluorescent orange ink over it, improving the glow even further. The only thing left to do was to load some green fluorescent ink into the airbrush and spray the shoulder mounted lights green, adding one more strong light and another color into our scene. And with that the models were done and the end result looks like this. As you can see, they look almost identical in color despite the completely different paints I used in the beginning. I slightly prefer the one I painted with the Kimera Kolors because I like my bluish tones more, but you can tell me which one you prefer in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you know what you need to do with those buttons, and see you guys in the next one.